In this video, we're talking about a family tragedy that's incredibly sad and difficult to wrap your head around. The story of Katie Fusco. Katie was a bright, warm young woman who was just starting to figure out her place in the world. She'd been adopted as a baby and grew up in a loving home with people who cared about her deeply. When she reached adulthood, she became curious about her biological parents. Like a lot of adoptees, she wanted to understand where she came from. That search ended up bringing her back into contact with her birth father, Stephen Plattle. At first, it looked like a long-separated family finally reconnecting in a meaningful way. But underneath what seemed like a hopeful reunion, there were things going on that nobody around her could fully see at the time. So let's start from the beginning. Stephen Plattle grew up in Levittown, New York. People who knew him back then described him as quiet, someone who kept to himself and didn't spend much time with other kids his age. Because of that, he was often picked on. Now, jump back to 1995. Stephen was 20 years old when he met a girl named Alyssa online. She lived in San Antonio, Texas. Alyssa was just 15 at the time, a big age gap that should have raised serious concerns. But the two of them started talking, and things escalated quickly. Before long, Stephen traveled from New York to Texas and showed up at Alyssa's house. He pushed for them to make their relationship official. It was clear he was taking advantage of the situation. Alyssa's parents were shocked by how fast everything was moving, but they didn't stop her from leaving with him and going back to New York. Not long after that, Alyssa became pregnant at 16. Everything was happening incredibly fast, too fast. And everyone around them could feel that things were already heading in a troubling direction. Things only got harder from that point on. Alyssa started to see more of who Stephen really was. His moods shifted fast. He could be calm one moment and harsh the next. And then she learned something that made everything worse. He had a history of hurting animals. That was when she began to realize just how unsafe her situation was. She was a teenager, far from home, in a state where she didn't know anyone, and she felt completely cut off from her family. And she was stuck living with someone she couldn't easily get away from. Even after their daughter, Denise, was born, Stephen's behavior didn't improve. When the baby cried, he would snap. At one point, he tried to quiet her by putting her inside a cooler. Thankfully, Alyssa found her in time, and the baby wasn't seriously hurt. Mostly because she was too young to understand what was happening. But the incident showed just how unpredictable and dangerous Stephen could be. He refused to care for Denise at all. He wouldn't hold her, feed her, or change her. It was like he felt nothing toward her, even though she was his child. And during all of this, Alyssa was dealing with her own abuse. In many ways, she was suffering just as much, if not more. It's heartbreaking to say, but Alyssa stayed. Maybe she was afraid. Maybe she'd been worn down over time and didn't see a way out. Whatever the reason, she couldn't bring herself to leave him, not even with her daughter in the house. But she did know one thing for sure. Denise wasn't safe. And to protect her, Alyssa made the incredibly difficult decision to give her up for adoption when she was 8 months old. Denise was taken in by the Fusco family, who gave her the kind of home she desperately needed. Years later, in 2006, Alyssa and Stephen got married. It's hard to understand why, but the most likely explanation is fear and emotional manipulation. Stephen often threatened to hurt himself if Alyssa ever tried to leave, and she believed him. She cared about him, even while living in fear of him, and the idea of something happening to him, even by his own hand, was something she couldn't handle. He understood that, and he used it. They went on to have 2 more daughters together, but Stephen didn't change. He continued to be controlling and unpredictable with Alyssa and showed little interest or care for any of his children. And honestly, looking at how things started, none of this came as a surprise. Not long after, the 4 of them moved to Henrico County, Virginia. Alyssa had to work constantly just to keep the household running, mostly because Stephen couldn't hold down a job. He drifted from one thing to the next, and the responsibility always landed on her. She tried several times to leave with the kids, but each time he used the same tactics: threats, emotional pressure, promises that he would make her life miserable even if he wasn't around anymore. He never stopped pushing those buttons. But as bad as things already were, the story was about to take an even sharper turn. While Alyssa was struggling to survive that relationship, Denise, now living with her adoptive family, was growing up in a completely different environment. The Fusco family in Dover, New York, welcomed her into their home and gave her a new name, Katie. It marked the beginning of a new life for her, and she grew up in a stable, caring household. Katie's childhood was pretty typical in the best way. She loved animals so much that she eventually stopped eating meat. She spent a lot of time drawing and writing, and she was already thinking about studying art and working in digital media. She joined the cheerleading team at Dover High School. She had dreams, plans, and a future she was excited about. It's amazing to see how far she'd come, considering how her life began. Her adoptive parents, Anthony and Kelly, gave her a real foundation. Anthony had worked as a prison guard at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, and Kelly worked as a secretary. They already had a daughter, but chose to adopt instead of having another biological child. There was nothing unusual or concerning about their home, just a steady, loving family who gave Katie exactly what she needed. Katie put a lot of heart into everything she did. She was thoughtful, creative, and mature for her age. Her writing showed a level of awareness and emotion that was far beyond what you usually expect from a teenager. She was incredibly talented. In 2016, she graduated from high school and was excited about starting college. But alongside all her plans, there was something she'd been thinking about for a long time. She wanted to find her biological parents. She had grown up in a supportive home, but she still felt a strong pull to understand her beginnings and, if possible, meet the people who brought her into the world. At 18, she finally decided it was time to try. Katie had a strong relationship with her adoptive parents and a close bond with her adoptive sister. But even with that support, she still felt that familiar pull many adoptees talk about, the desire to understand where you come from in a literal, personal way. It's a normal curiosity, wanting to know the people who brought you into the world and what parts of them might live in you. Katie felt that too. She wanted answers about her background, her history, and her identity. What she didn't realize was that some of those answers would come with painful consequences. She hoped reconnecting would give her some sense of closure, maybe even a relationship with the father she imagined or hoped for. Instead, she found Stephen Plattle. In August 2016, she tracked down her birth mother, Alyssa, on Facebook and reached out. Her adoptive parents, Anthony and Kelly, had always been open with her about her adoption, so she likely knew at least a little about her early life. Still, nearly 2 decades had passed, and she had no idea what her birth parents were like now. Alyssa, who was still living with Stephen and working multiple jobs to keep the household afloat, saw Katie's message and was genuinely excited. She and Katie started talking online and eventually made plans to meet. They met in Knightdale, North Carolina, and spent hours together. For Alyssa, seeing Katie, her Denise, grown, healthy, and happy was overwhelming. She had loved her from the beginning, and giving her up had been the hardest decision of her life. For 18 years, she had marked Katie's due date on every calendar and quietly hoped she was doing well. Katie, in turn, was thrilled to meet her birth mother. Learning that her biological parents were still together and that she had 2 younger sisters made her feel like her family had expanded overnight. But there was one thing Katie didn't know. She had never been told about the abuse, or that the reason she'd been placed for adoption was to protect her. And we still don't know exactly why Alyssa didn't share that part of the story. It's understandable that Alyssa didn't bring up the abuse during their first meeting. That's not the kind of conversation you drop on someone you're just getting to know again, especially a daughter you haven't seen since she was a baby. And for whatever reason, Katie didn't ask right away why she'd been placed for adoption. Maybe she planned to ask later, maybe she was overwhelmed, or maybe they were both just trying to enjoy the moment. So they kept things light. They talked about their lives, their interests, and everything that had happened over the last 18 years. Alyssa didn't push Katie to move in or change anything about her life. She saw how well Katie was doing and was genuinely proud of her. Then Katie met Stephen. And surprisingly, that first meeting went smoothly, better than anyone expected. But soon after, Katie made a decision that caught everyone off guard. She wanted to move in with her biological parents. For her adoptive parents, Anthony and Kelly, it felt like the ground shifted underneath them. They had no warning. Stephen and Alyssa agreed to let her come, but no one outside that household knew what Stephen was really capable of or what he had in mind. Katie had been excited about college, about studying art, and about building a future she'd worked toward for years. But after reconnecting with her birth parents, she put all of that on hold. She wanted to live with them, get to know them, and rebuild the family she felt she'd never had. When her adoptive parents heard this, they were stunned. They tried to talk to her about her plans, but she was legally an adult. She could choose for herself. And they didn't want to stand in the way of her finally learning where she came from. That was the hardest part, supporting her while being terrified for her. Meanwhile, Stephen was thrilled. The idea of Katie moving in seemed to light him up in a way that wasn't typical for him. But inside that household, things weren't as whole as they looked. Stephen and Alyssa were barely functioning as a couple. They still lived under the same roof, but they had separate bedrooms and were basically leading separate lives. Their marriage was almost over, the separation was well underway, but nothing had been finalized yet. Stephen was genuinely excited about Katie moving in, but pretty quickly, some things started to feel off. Alyssa noticed almost immediately that Stephen's interest in her had completely faded. Yes, they were already struggling and heading toward a separation, but once Katie arrived, it was like he stopped acknowledging Alyssa altogether. His attention shifted entirely to Katie. Over time, Stephen even started changing how he looked. He began dressing in a way that seemed meant to make him look younger. New clothes, longer hair, trying to match the style of someone much younger than he was. It stood out, especially for a man in his mid-40s. Then his behavior took an even stranger turn. He moved out of his own bedroom and started sleeping on the floor in Katie's room. When Alyssa saw this, she didn't know what to make of it. She confronted him, but he brushed it off. Eventually, he and Katie left the house together, and the whole thing just felt wrong. They still had 2 younger children living there, and everyone in the house was confused and uncomfortable. No one could understand what was happening. By November 2016, Alyssa decided she had to leave. She moved out, and she and Stephen shared custody of their daughters. But her leaving the home made everything that followed even more complicated. A few months later, in May 2017, Alyssa discovered something that made her physically ill. One of her daughters had left a diary open, and in it she found a note saying that Stephen and Katie were in a relationship. And not only that, Katie was pregnant. Alyssa was horrified. She called Stephen right away, desperate for an explanation. His response was shockingly casual. He simply said, "I thought you knew. We love each other," as if he didn't grasp the weight of what he was admitting. A father involved with his own daughter. That's basically what Stephen did best at this point. Drive everyone around him up the wall. And honestly, people had good reason to feel that way. Alyssa did call the police on him, but nothing came of it. No one was arrested. While all that was happening, Stephen and Katie moved in with his mother in Knightdale, North Carolina, and they started planning a wedding. To this day, I still can't wrap my head around how his mom allowed any of this. There were so many obvious problems, so many chances for someone to step in, and yet everything kept moving forward like it was normal. Alyssa thought calling the cops would be enough, that once the authorities knew what was going on, they'd handle it. But that didn't happen. And then things somehow escalated even more. The wedding actually went through. Stephen and Katie got married in Parkton, Maryland, on July 20th, 2017. His mom was there. Katie's adoptive parents were there. Stephen was 43. Katie was 20. Katie even posted wedding photos on social media, and you could clearly see she was pregnant. The situation was already disturbing on its own, but seeing both families smiling in the photos made it feel even more unreal. Like they were all pretending nothing was wrong. I'd like to think they were just putting on a polite face to avoid making a scene, but honestly, that's hard to believe. Every part of this was wrong. And beyond wrong, it was illegal. But Stephen wasn't just manipulative. He was calculated. He told officials that he and Katie weren't biologically related, which allowed the paperwork to slip through. Technically, that made the marriage legal enough to get filed. And then there were Katie's adoptive parents. They didn't fight it. They didn't stop it. And Katie, she was an adult. She wasn't being threatened the way Alyssa had been. She wasn't trapped. She chose this. What makes it even more confusing is that Alyssa had already warned her. Before Katie ever moved out, Alyssa told her everything. That Steven had abused her when she was a baby. That he had threatened her. That he had hurt people before. She tried to tell Katie the truth, but Katie didn't react at all. It was like talking to someone who wasn't really processing anything. She didn't show emotion, didn't seem worried, didn't even seem upset. She just didn't believe Alyssa. Alyssa was convinced that Steven had influenced Katie and turned her against her, and honestly, it was heartbreaking to see. The whole situation sounded unreal, but it was actually happening, and it was only getting more complicated. Katie gave birth to a baby boy on September 1st, 2017, not even 2 months after that bizarre wedding. She named him Bennett Plattle. Then, in January 2018, both Steven and Katie were arrested, which, at that point, felt inevitable. In court, Steven's lawyer argued that the relationship was mutual, that Steven was in love with his daughter, who was 18 at the time. He even claimed that their feelings mattered more than the fact that they were biologically related. That completely missed the point. Despite everything, Steven and Katie were released on bond. Bennett was placed with Steven's mother, and the court ordered Steven and Katie not to have any contact with each other. Katie moved back in with her adoptive parents, and that's when things finally started to shift. Once she had some distance, she began to see the situation for what it really was. She called Steven and told him she wanted a divorce, immediately. Steven didn't handle that well. He didn't want Alyssa gone. He didn't want Katie gone. And when Katie finally cut ties for good, he spiraled. He convinced himself that her adoptive parents had somehow turned her against him, even though that clearly wasn't the case. And then things took a darker turn. Before the events of April 11, 2018, Steven had already made up his mind. If he couldn't have the life he wanted, he was going to destroy everything connected to it. In his mind, that included anyone he believed had pulled Katie away from him, even his own infant son, Bennett. But he wasn't finished. He was still focused on Katie. On April 12th, he figured out where she was. She had gone with her adoptive father, Anthony, to Waterbury, Connecticut, to help her grandmother clean her house. They had left their home in Dover earlier that day. Steven knew exactly where Katie would be. He drove from North Carolina to Dover and waited near her house until she and her adoptive father left for Connecticut. Cameras in the area later showed parts of what happened next. Katie and Anthony were driving on a fairly busy road, heading toward New Milford, Connecticut. Steven was right behind them in a Honda minivan. What made it even more alarming was that he had a loaded gun sitting next to him in the passenger seat. He wasn't following them by accident. He was waiting for a moment to act. He found that moment a few minutes later. When Anthony slowed down at a stop sign where Route 7 meets Route 55, Steven pulled up beside them and opened fire into their car. People nearby said everything had been quiet, and then suddenly they heard a series of loud bangs at the intersection. When the noise stopped, the minivan sped away. Someone called 911 immediately. When police and paramedics reached the car, the scene was devastating. Katie and Anthony were both unresponsive in their seats, and the interior of the car made it clear how violent the attack had been. Steven had fired repeatedly, making sure he didn't miss. At first, officers had no idea who was responsible. They only knew that 2 people had been shot and that the suspect was gone. That changed when they received another 911 call, this one from Steven's mother. She was distraught and told them that Steven had called her and confessed to everything. Police rushed to her home, but Steven wasn't there. He had already left. About 18 miles from where Katie and Anthony were found, officers located a silver minivan parked in Dover. Inside was Steven, who had taken his own life. The same gun used in the earlier shooting was in his hand. Whether he planned all of this from the beginning or panicked once he realized what he'd done will never be fully known. But in the end, he avoided facing the consequences of what he'd carried out. In the end, Steven carried out his actions and took them to the grave, leaving the families of his victims without closure or justice. Bennett, Katie, and Anthony were buried together at St. Charles Cemetery in Dover Plains, New York, on April 21, 2018. For Alyssa, The pain and the mistakes she lived with will never completely go away. Her own husband ended up killing her daughter. It's hard to even make sense of whether it was sickness, cruelty, or something else entirely. 3 lives were lost, and no one was held accountable because Stephen acted alone. There's no silver lining here. No happy ending. No lesson that can make up for the tragedy. People like him, murderers, abusers, manipulators, don't usually teach us anything new. Often the warning signs are there, in neighbors, in parents, in spouses, sometimes all of the above. Cases like this leave a lot of questions. What could have been done differently? Could anything have prevented it? And most importantly, was justice ever truly served? I'd really like to hear what you think. Thanks for watching Murder Ledger. We look into real cases from across the world, the ones that raise tough questions and stay with you long after they're over. If you're interested in stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and join the conversation.